Hi, it's Roger Green, host of the Surfing the Nash Tsunami podcast. This week, all our posted conversations will contain completed contents from our year-end interviews, edited only slightly for flow and background noise. This conversation is with our good friend Hannes Hagström. Hannes discusses some of the research, most of which epidemiology-based, coming from his team at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. Just a reminder, Surfing the Nash Tsunami will have next-day coverage of the 2 presentation days at NASHTAG, posting the Friday session around 6 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on Saturday, and the Saturday session around 6 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on Sunday. And here's Hannes. So this afternoon, as our interview series continues, we're here with our friend Hannes Hagström. The purpose of this series of interviews is to talk a little bit about folks' impressions in general of the year 2022 in fatty liver disease, and then some of the work that they've been doing this year that has made a contribution to the field. So Hannes, first, just general impressions of the year in fatty liver and areas where you feel we've made progress or have reasons for encouragement, if any areas where you feel that you wish we had more reason to be encouraged.
Hannes Hagström.
Yeah, thank you. So I think 2022 was a good year for NAFLD research. Sure, we saw some sort of failed trials, which feels like standard now in this field. But I also think there's, with all the phase 3 trials now about to read out in this year or next, I think there's actually some relevant hope. And I think the mechanisms by which with the drugs we are now trying, to me, feels quite a bit more realistic to actually work in the general population.
It's an interesting comment. When you say realistic, are there specific mechanisms you have in mind? And what makes you use the word realistic to define them?
So I always think about NAFLD like a public health problem, and that you're sort of overloading your system with nutrients. And one major way we need to combat this is to reduce the general load on the metabolic system. And this is my personal opinion, but going through a specific molecular pathway might not do it. There are so much redundancy in these systems. So I think a general pathway would be to try to reduce the general burden on the system. And that's what we're trying to do now with the drugs that are in the late phase 3 trials with, for instance, of course, GLP-1s, which is sort of leading the way, but also perhaps with resmetirom. We'll probably know more in a few weeks, but quite a lot in NAFLD, and we've developed a nice population-based cohort of liver disease patients that we are doing a lot of studies on, so that really sort of have turned the wheel around quite a lot in my research group.
Why don't we follow that wheel and step into your patient cohort and studies? Of the various things that you've produced this year.
Yeah, sure. So not all the listeners maybe are aware of the registers that are available in the Nordic countries, which is Scandinavia and Sweden. So we have this tax-funded system where essentially healthcare is generally free of charge, except some smaller fees. So you have less problems with selection bias. And then we have rather accurate registers for finding people when they're hospitalized, when they go to their specialty doctor, like their gastroenterologist or their hepatologist. We can identify, prescribed drugs automatically from the pharmacies and so on. And all of this data points can be merged through some unique identifiers that we have for each person, and then we can also identify everybody with a specific diagnosis, but we can also track them across these different registers and see if they develop comorbidities, if they die, if they get cancer, so on and so on. So it's not as granular as you would like it. We mostly don't have any lab data and so on, but at least you have very few problems with selection bias, and you can really capture the whole population, the burden of disease. So for that, using that data source, we put together a large cohort of everybody in Sweden who had a diagnosis of really any liver disease going back to the 60s. So it's quite a big cohort, around 350,000 people. And then we can identify them, look at really anything, who with NAFLD developed cancer or who with NAFLD got prescription of GLP-1s or so on and so forth. And then we can also link them to the general population to see what is there a difference in cardiovascular outcomes if you compare it to the general population. So a multitude of studies can be done in that cohort, and we started to feel it a little bit. And we have a lot of projects going on, and some are already published and finished.
So of what you've published in the past year, which one or two would you like to focus on in terms of what we've learned and what you think it's going to mean for the field going forward?
I think one other thing I want to highlight is some of the work some of my rather excellent postdocs have been doing, who are really good with epidemiology and biostatistics, and I feel so fortunate to be working with these sort of young and energetic people. But my postdoc Jing Shang, she had a paper in hepatology this year where we looked at risk for cardiovascular disease, but also risk for mortality after cardiovascular disease. And another a little bit innovative way, which we haven't seen so much in this field, was also trying to estimate the loss in life expectancy in people with NAFLD. So in essence, we identified everybody with diagnosis of NAFLD in Sweden, looked at the risk that they had to develop cardiovascular disease, and then you compare the risk of dying after a cardiovascular event to that of people without NAFLD, but that also had a cardiovascular event. And strikingly, what we could see was that patients with NAFLD, they have a much higher rate of developing CVD events, which we already knew. But after the CVD event, there's no difference in overall mortality, actually, if you compare it to people that did not have at least known NAFLD diagnosis at the time of their CVD event. Now, of course, those people might all have undiagnosed NAFLD, so there's a lot of caveats when you do these kind of studies as well. At least that sort of points out that if you have patients with cardiovascular disease events, might not be necessarily to go and see if they have an NAFLD at that point in time. And the second part of that paper was that we tried to estimate the loss in life expectancy. We found rather strikingly that in general, if you have NAFLD, you can expect to live around 3 years shorter than if you don't have this diagnosis, if you compare it to the general population. And that loss in life expectancy was actually accentuated depending on when you got the diagnosis. So the younger age you have your diagnosis of NAFLD, the more you can expect to have a drop in life expectancy. And that sort of tells us that might be more relevant to look for NAFLD, relatively at least, to look for NAFLD in the younger populations, whereas if you are coming up to an advanced age, 70, 75, 80 plus, then it might not be super relevant to look for NAFLD, which is rather logical that you don't have so much time to be left on.
Jörn Schattenberg.
This data is fascinating, to be honest, and again, congratulations for you and your team to putting this together. It aligns with the clinical observation that liver disease is slowly progressive, and if you have a hepatic steatosis at the age of 80, it's not the same as if you have it in young years, and it kind of aligns with the BMI story where towards the end of your life, it pays off to have a little higher BMI than actually your mortality is not quite, it's not L-shaped, right, relationship. So that is nice. We've discussed this a number of times, and my question to you is, of course, you're using codes, and what is your perception, having worked with that database so intensively, what's your perception of which type of NAFLD patient is coded versus how many do we miss, or how could those patients who are not coded fit into that? Do you think that we miss the early ones, the late ones, or is there a certain pattern, or you think it's obviously difficult to say no answer, but maybe what's your gut feeling on this?
Yeah, it's of course, you really need to work with these data sets to understand the caveats and the limitations, but also the strengths. But in general, so we capture everybody who have a diagnosis in specialty care. What we see, if we look at the incidence, we see a strikingly increasing number of NAFLD diagnoses during the later years. I do not think that reflects the true incidence increase, but it's more reflective that clinicians are now more and more recognizing NAFLD. So it's difficult to say that it's a true increase in incidence or prevalence. And as for your question about the severity, I think definitely we do. These are patients coming to a specialty doctor, so it's unfortunately not including primary care. But when we look at it, we see that around 5% or something like that have a diagnosis of cirrhosis. But I would also fear it's a little bit underdiagnosed. So maybe some sloppy clinicians only make the diagnosis of NAFLD and don't care about making the diagnosis for cirrhosis. Who knows? So there are some caveats there as well, but definitely you probably capture the sort of sicker population as compared to the full NAFLD spectrum, which is estimated to be somewhere around 15 to 20% in Sweden.
Louise Campbell.
From your data sets, can you tell what tends to come first? Is it metabolic conditions in relation to NAFLD, or does NAFLD come first and metabolic in the data set? Is it established later? And if so, can you date the precursor to each one with the biopsy and the diagnosis of NASH? Because obviously NASH takes a long time and most people to develop. My thinking being that if you then get a metabolic condition and you've already got NASH, it's probably been building during rather than that thing. Were you able to tease out that from the data sets?
That's a good question, Louise. We haven't actually looked at that. As I said, there's so many questions we can ask to this sort of data set, but it's actually quite an interesting topic that we could explore further, what is coming first, so to say. Another thing I want to highlight is that you can do this kind of register-based stuff and it gives you a nice coverage, but it stands out a little bit more when you connect more detailed data sets to these registers. So you can, for instance, link your own research cohort to these registers, and you can then get the potential for long-term follow-up. So we have done a few of those studies where we have looked at biopsies of patients with NAFLD and link them to these registers, and that allows us for long-term follow-up. Then you have the granularity of the biopsy, and you have lab tests and BMI and whatever that you captured from the charts yourself or some coworker, and then you can get a long-term follow-up. And then you can also, what we're doing right now is collaborating with the Swedish Diabetes Register, which is quite remarkable. They capture 90% of everybody with type 2 diabetes or even more. So you have more granularity of the data, such as BMI, HbA1c levels, and so on. So we're doing a study right now where we're looking at the number of comorbidities. So if you have diabetes plus minus hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and so on, what happens to the risk of liver disease? Because we know already that it's patients with type 2 diabetes. We are more and more discussing, should we screen them for liver disease? We have seen that the incidence of liver decompensation and liver cancer is more than twice as high in patients with diabetes, but there might be subgroups of patients with diabetes where we should look even further. And so we're trying to tease that out. Should we look for, people with age 50 plus, or men versus women, hypertension versus not having hypertension, and so on? That is one project we're working on right now. And maybe not answering your question in full, but at least to some degree.
No, but it is interesting when you talk about looking at the younger generation and NAFLD. And I think it is something that we miss because we're looking for end stage and fibrosis outcomes. I do think the younger generation are the ones in need, because we are hosing money on a lot more younger people than we are on the minority of cirrhosis and fibrosis. When you look at the figures and were to do the calculations, we miss the ones that are low cost individually but are high cost collectively. But we have the greatest opportunity to turn around their lives and increase their life expectancy and potentially keep them off the diabetes database, because I'm fairly sure there will be a fair few, as you move on, have crossed from the liver database and data set to the diabetes data set. And certainly in the UK, our diabetes data sets are immaculate in their data recording throughout the country.
I'm thinking about reversing direction on that. If you take a look at the guidelines that are emerging, a common theme, at least in some of the recent guidelines, ACE, for example, is not even to worry about whether a patient with diabetes has NAFLD per se, because the odds are that 70, 75, 80% of them do at the time that you identify diagnosis. So there, the issue is to go straight to taking a look for, the suggestion is go straight to taking a look for fibrosis. Assume everybody has NAFLD, and then ask yourself who's got NASH and evidence of fibrosis. I'm wondering if, as you pull the databases together, any data emerge on that subject, because it seems that you get to take a look from both directions. It almost feels like kind of a 360-degree view of the patient. You can look at NAFLD through a diabetes window or diabetes through a NAFLD window if you bring the data sets together.
If we go back to screening, there are guidelines on who should we screen, or when should we start to think about screening. To be honest, I don't think we fully meet all of those criteria right now in the NAFLD the field, because one major criteria is that we should be able to intervene in some way, and we can do that. But the argument is, if we talk about weight loss or exercise, etc., that this is something these patients should do anyway. And I don't think we have the data to support that. Knowing that you have NAFLD will actually make the patient change the way they live. Maybe we are just, argument against that could be that we are just introducing more harm, that we are scaring these patients that you will get cirrhosis and so some things like that. When we do get some kind of treatment for this disease, I think we will end up in another situation. And actually, I think it's nice that we start to develop this thinking with screening already now, so we don't have to start from scratch when we have something we can offer the patients. I'm not sure if that was an answer to your question.
The question of screening is very interesting, Hannes, and I'm with you that we don't adhere to all the guidelines. Not all patients with diabetes are screened for NASH, and there are many reasons for that. As you're on, I think I'd like to revisit what we're actually screening for. You made the case that screening for steatosis in elderly might not be the right way. The historic data, and some of this comes from your group, has very heavily focused on advanced fibrosis, and we know there's liver mortality. But maybe you can give us your insight again. What's the role of NASH, and does NASH correlate to loss in life? And did you see a little bit of a swing that maybe not fibrosis is the only aspect that's important, or we don't have that data yet? What's your view?
So unfortunately, if we look at these register-based things, we don't have the granularity where we can say that somebody has NASH or not, because of course you need a biopsy, and what we have seen is the number of biopsies are generally going down because we have replaced it with more non-invasive techniques, meaning that also you get some kind of bias, because the biopsies that you do take these days, if you compare to the 80s or 90s, they are probably more advanced, the more advanced cases. So it's difficult that you see a change in the prevalence or proportion of patients having NASH and so on. Myself, having sat and looked at a lot of biopsies, it is unfortunately quite subjective, as we all know, and it's difficult to tease out the individual effect of of NASH. My thinking of this is currently that NASH is of course the thing that drives the inflammation and so on, but it's so difficult to capture, meaning that it's maybe not even worth trying to capture, because if it's so difficult to measure it, then we will end up in a tricky situation if we want to look at treatment response and so on. Of course, it's still a very tricky situation to tease out what is the individual effect. We should go for something that is as simple as possible and that can give us a good estimation of risk. So we just got actually a paper accepted where we looked at trying to develop the FIB4 in a more meaningful way, or where we see that we can, if you break down the three main categories of FIB4, we looked at this in a population of around 130,000 people with lab data and long-term register follow-up that we published on a little bit before. What we can see, if you can actually break down these risk categories, so you have the FIB4, you get the low, intermediate and high risk group, and you can actually break down those subgroups in more meaningful groups where you can see, well, in the low group you actually have people that have more than 10-13% risk of developing cirrhosis within 10 years, and within the high risk group you can go from something like 3% to 35%. So you can identify quite meaningful subgroups where you should really start to look for fibrosis and for liver disease. Maybe I can tell you the three parameters that we could use to improve the FIB4. Do you want to guess, Jörn?
Okay, that's a good one. Let me see.
While Jörn is figuring this out, I want to tell you that we've done 160-something episodes of this, and this is the first time we've ever had a game show in the middle of a podcast.
That's good,
I'm
right?
thinking of bringing on 30...
And it caught me a little bit by surprise.
I'm thinking of bringing on 30 seconds of game show music, the Jeopardy music from the U.S. Da, 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 da. And then when we get to the end, Jörn has to give an answer.
No, but I wanted to take something that was quite simple that we could use in primary care and so on. But only age and presence of diabetes and gamma GT.
Gamma GT, that's interesting because that's linked to cardiovascular in some population-based studies, right?
Yes, it is. It's one of the things that the insurance companies use because it's so linked to overall mortality and outcomes.
I was going to say, just on Jörn's point, that there's also been some discussion in the literature recently about FIB4 in detailing not only severe liver disease but cardiac disease, and doing the studies and comparing both cardiac outcomes and liver outcomes in those populations using the normal cutoffs. So they're moving it towards cardiology now as well, from what I can see. I think Scott Isaac's been talking about it a little bit.
Yeah, what I was going to mention also that if we're honest, I think we also know that gamma GT is an imperfect marker for alcohol use. So also highlighting something we've discussed more and more during 2022, and we finally started to agree upon as a field that a minority, maybe 5-10% of these patients with NAFLD, they probably drink a little bit too much, and you have alcohol that is at least driving part of the disease pathogenesis. So I think it was interesting that this marker came out as one of the more relevant ones. So there's a preliminary paper now accepted, but we're gonna try to dig even further into that field. I just hired a new postdoc who is a mathematician who is going to work his magic on that, and I hope he will come up with something interesting in the coming year or so.
A moment ago, I was wondering whether you were heading towards nomenclature, actually, because when you start to think about where alcohol fits into this mix, you get back into that discussion about, so what is this disease in the first place and what are we calling it? We try to stay out of that conversation, except when we stumble into it. It kind of feels like we're stumbling there. But do you have any thoughts on, say, what was discussed in Washington, or where that discussion tends to be heading in the context of what's in your database?
I certainly agree that this is a problem, and I think we should wait for the consensus to come to its conclusions. Again, you can argue that, yes, it's good with an umbrella term for this disease, and there are a lot of diseases out there, not only NAFLD, where you have an umbrella term and there are different causes of the same sort of phenotype. So where that ends up, it's going to be interesting to look at, but it certainly is something to consider when you design these kind of studies. How sure can you be that what's reported is actually what the patient had and so on? Always caveats with these kind of things, yes.
My additional thought went back to something that Hannes said at the beginning, which was reducing the metabolic load. What would your feel be? Do we reduce the metabolic load and the load on the liver to help the other metabolic conditions, or do we try and treat the other metabolic conditions to preserve the liver? Bit of both? Or where would you suggest we go on that when we look at the medications?
I would be interested to hear more about the guys working in clinical trials, and pharma is thinking about that. But my perspective would be a bit more from the epidemiology side and maybe public health perspective, that of course it's nicer to have something which has few side effects and that have both metabolic and liver specific metabolic effects. So we don't end up in a situation where we improve the risk for liver-related outcomes, but increase the risk for cardiovascular outcomes or vice versa. But I think that is where the field is going right now. So it's looking good, I think.
As long as we have Hannes with us, I was going to throw another question at him and see if he has an answer. Maybe there is none. I don't know. I was always struck by genetic differences between North and Southern Europe, and there's also some very different manifestations in terms of disease. For example, some inflammatory bowel disease, PSC, seems to be more prone in northern countries. We haven't seen anything for that in NASH, as far as I'm aware. Do you have any data on genetics that you compared Nordic countries with other or Southern, or is there anything you've worked on or you've been aware of?
We had one paper on genetics this year looking at the prospective or predictive power of PNPLA3 and some other genotypes in a cohort study, but not with that particular question looking at a north-south gradient. Of course, we know that the proportion of patients with a harmful PNPLA3 genotype differs quite a lot, but that's old news, of course. But I guess such a study where you suggest, Jörn, is you need quite a lot of DNA from different parts of the world, and it's always one of the risks with working in a small country, that even if you capture the whole country, it's still only around 10 million people.
But you do have genetic information in the registries in parts, is that correct?
No, it depends on the registers you're referring to, but in general, no, we don't sort of genotype the full population. It would be awesome if we could do that, but I think the GDPR guys would have something to say about that. But we do have, when you have cohorts with genetic data, you can link it to the registries to look at the difference in outcomes, but not the other way around,
So one of the interesting things that goes along with that, particularly, by the way, in a smaller country, is the interplay of microbiome and genetics. So we tend to associate PNPLA3 more with certain populations than others. Those populations, at least in some of the larger countries, say the U.S., tend to eat different diets. So you see higher levels of PNPLA3 in certain ethnic populations that have certain kinds of diet characteristics. I'm wondering if being in a smaller country, whether that either helps because you don't have as much diet diversity, or you do have as much diet diversity. Well, if you do have as much diet diversity, can you do anything with that at all?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a really tough question. And I guess I have I have a dietitian in my group who is excellent in diets and different compositions. I think she would argue that even within a small country like this, there would be huge variances in the type of food people are eating in, the urban areas or the rural areas. And also within cities, there are immigrant communities where you eat quite different foods from other areas. And of course, what is the chicken and the egg? Is the microbiota affecting what you eat, or is what you and so on? So the cause and effect always is a problem in these kind of studies. I think there are also studies, looking if you measure the microbiota at two different time points in the same individual, it shifts quite a lot. I always read those kind of microbiota studies with a careful perspective.
And you're probably right on that. Based on the data Hannes has produced, we have so many questions, and we have to realize that you can't always answer all questions with all databases, albeit the absolute wealth of that data set.
Yeah, you can say that you can look at the big picture, you can look at the trends, you can look at the burden of disease, you can look at how many people are, or proportion of the population are actually diagnosed with X and what's going on with those people. But if you want to go into mechanisms and really what happens on a molecular level, you're not going to go there. But I also think that's nice within the field that you have different research groups from across the world and focusing on different things. Some are using this kind of register-based stuff where you see the big picture, and other research groups are trying to really develop new drugs, and then you have others trying to find out the mechanism. And I really feel super happy to be in this community where we all have the vision of trying to help our patients. Really appreciate that.
So one of the places I was going, and this actually comes out of having a market research background that is half between the two, is that if you've got a small population with, say, some distinguishing markers, lower levels of disease, for example, or different kinds of relationships in disease than you'd find, say, in a Middle Eastern, North African population, is there anything we can infer at a population level about the differences between the two that is borne out epidemiologically? And that was kind of where I was going with the question about PNPLA3, but I think the answer just might be no, that we need to dive into in a different way to get there. So Hannes, what does 2023 hold for you and for your research?
Excellent question. So hopefully some more use of this data that we already have. And we also, in terms of granularity, we now have another big database coming out that we will delve even more into. We can say that it's the majority of the people living in the capital of Sweden, Stockholm, that have an ALT value measured. So it's around 800,000 people, something like that, where we have a lot more granularity. So we're going to try to maybe repeat a few of the studies we have done, but with more data. Scandinavia. Then as I started saying, I have a rather nice team now with a lot of younger researchers, and I'm employing a few more during the start of the next year that are joining us. So I'm really looking forward to working with them and trying to guide what we are going to look at in terms of developing maybe new models, how we can try to predict people developing severe liver disease, meaning that we can target the populations for screening and treatment. And then I'm, of course, also looking forward to meeting everybody on the many conferences that we are having. I'm not going to as many meetings as you guys, but I think I will hopefully see you at a few of them.
Well, that'll be fantastic.
And I'm looking forward to it. And every time I meet Hannes, they always have a big Swedish group also, and he twitters about, the big group gathering, and it looks like the Swedish are very fond of traveling and getting together. So a very social group, Hannes.
We did something called a Nordic Network, where we tried to get all the junior people, not only from Sweden, but also from the other Nordic countries, to get together and network and mingle. And been difficult for the younger people to build their own networks during the COVID situation. So it's a good opportunity for them to meet other people in their situation.
So I'm reflecting, Louise and Hannes, when I was surprised that the two of you hadn't met face to face. The reason, specifically now that I remember, is because, Hannes, the first time I met you was you were meeting Jörn in a hotel lobby in London at EASL this year, and we were introduced. And I was there to meet Louise and her cohort of nurses that had done an episode with us back in February. So I had the two of you placed in my mind because I met you within 5 minutes, one way or the other, of being in a conversation with Louise and some of the nurses. And I guess it never crossed my mind, Louise, that you weren't part of that conversation as well. But yeah, I think Jörn, that speaks powerfully to the importance of personal meetings, as you comment on frequently, and of all of us getting together. Even if we sometimes get to jumble faces, minds, and places a little bit, just by 5 minutes. Hannes, thank you so much for your time today. I come out of a marketing research background, which relies heavily on secondary. I find a lot of the epidemiology that you do really fascinating, and look forward to seeing more work from you ahead and seeing you at least one or two conferences.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I have to go on being on call tonight.
Oh, thank you, my friend. So we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.
Please join us again tomorrow for the full conversation between Jörn, Louise, Roger, and their guest, Donna Cryer, here on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.